What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and Storm was confirmed to be Omega level in X-Men 97, so I figured let's explain mutant classifications and particularly what it means to be Omega and beyond Omega level, because beyond Omega level is a whole different beast. And I'll actually have a playlist that's really cool at the end of this video for you. So when it comes to Marvel Comics and power classifications, let's kick things off here with your Epsilon mutants. These are the guys that nobody wants to be. These are mutants that have powers that more often than not cause a physical mutation that makes life harder for them than anything else. A good example of this is the character Mole, right? You actually know him from X-Men the Animated Series because he has red hair. In the comics, it's actually black-brown hair, looks a little bit different. Mole can scratch, he can claw, he can burrow underground, and that's basically it, right? I mean, it sucks to be that guy, right? That's why he's a Morlock living in the sewers of New York, because his powers are more of a hindrance than anything else. After Epsilon, you have Beta level. These are mutant powers that can be useful, but don't really have much in the way of practical application when it comes to like offense and defense. These are your guys like Gambit. I use Gambit as an example because a misnomer is that Gambit is alpha or omega. That's not really true. Gambit's beta. We know that because he was sitting out in the hallway crying while Rogue was getting her back blown out by Magneto. That's not funny. In all actuality, these are your guys like Caliban, or maybe even Forge, depending on how you want to look at it. But Caliban is a mutant that can track the location of any mutant, no matter where they are, as long as they are within a 25-mile radius of his location. Now, he also has a decent level of super strength, which is okay. I mean, it's not enough to, put the beat down on Colossus or anything like that, but he can kind of hold his own sometimes, go toe-to-toe with Captain America maybe, and he can use people's fears against them. And that's basically it. Looking at somebody like Forge, for example, talking about him for a second, his mutant power basically turns him into Tony Stark. So if you took his X gene away, he wouldn't be capable. And in fact, guys like Tony Stark, Reed Richards, people like that, they're smarter than he is, which is something that we will address when it comes to Jonathan Hickman's definition of what an Omega level mutant is. But after Beta level, you have your Alpha level mutants. Now, 99% of mutants in Marvel Comics, they're Alpha level. Their power exists in such a way to where it's a combination of offense and defensive capabilities that make them a threat to most anybody who's out there. So these are your guys like Cyclops, Morph, Copycat, right? Copycat basically has the same power set as Morph. She can shapeshift into virtually anybody and copy their powers when she does. Mystique is not like that. Mystique can only take on their physical form, and that's it. But after Alpha level, which is really what you guys are here for, kind of while we fast tracked through everything else, you've got Omega level. Now, Omega level in Marvel Comics has historically been handled in a couple of different ways. There is the pre-Hickman method and the post-Hickman method, and I'll explain what that means here in a little bit. But the classic way of doing things before Jonathan Hickman was that Omega and beyond Omega level was a way to basically establish a mutant whose powers were either at the upper limit of what those powers were capable of, or had somehow gone beyond what that upper limit was capable of. I always defined it as Omega level was basically a threat to Earth, and beyond Omega level was a threat to the universe or the multiverse. But again, these definitions kind of varied because they were so ambiguous. But to differentiate between an Omega level mutant and everybody else, right? Let's use Jean Grey, who's an Omega level telepath, and Monet St. Croix, who's just your regular average run-of-the-mill telepath. Monet St. Croix can read the thoughts of others. She can project her thoughts into the minds of others, right? Basic mind control. And then she can protect herself from psychic attacks. Full stop. That's really it, right? Jean Grey is a whole different beast, right? Jean Grey, at some point over the course of her publication history, whether through the Phoenix Force or without the Phoenix Force and just her telepathy in and of itself, this woman has done things like she's wiped people's memories away and replaced them with new ones. She's blocked people's access to their powers using telepathy. She can read all the minds on Earth and, if she wanted to, control all the minds on Earth. That's what you're talking about when it comes to an Omega level telepath. The highest level of what a telepath is capable of within reason, if we're being honest with ourselves. But it doesn't just stop at like telepathy and the highest levels of how a power can be used on this kind of fictitious scale of 1 to 100. Other methods of classifying a mutant as being Omega level could be based on like the number of powers they had. So a good example of this are characters like Apocalypse and Legion. Apocalypse was born with immortality, but once he came into contact with celestial technology, that gave him the ability to control the atomic structure of his body. So he could basically give himself any physical superhuman power that you can imagine. He can fire energy blasts, he can fly, he can teleport, he can shapeshift, grow to any size, all kinds of cool stuff, right? Legion had thousands of personalities, and each one of these personalities had a power. Some of these powers were duplicates, but they all had powers nonetheless, and they ran a whole gamut. Right? So the personality of Susan and Sunshine could manipulate your emotional state, make you feel happy or sad. Whereas the Origamist, that personality could bend reality. Now, once you got beyond that and you went into beyond Omega level, it was stupid the kind of power that these guys could pull off, right? I mean, it was nuts, the level of power that these guys had, right? So let's use like beyond Omega level telekinetic, which I know a lot of you guys are kind of like, those don't really exist. They do, you just don't realize they do. So like a beta level telekinetic could move a pencil back and forth. An alpha level telekinetic could lift an aircraft carrier out of the water. An Omega level telekinetic could potentially like move the Earth out of the sun's orbit, right? A beyond Omega level telekinetic, their power level would be so extreme, they could manipulate the atomic structure of matter using their telekinesis. But you and I refer to that as reality warping, right? Just the rearranging of matter on the atomic level. And this is why 99% of beyond Omega level characters out there could warp reality. So these are your guys like Mad Jim Jaspers, whose reality manipulation powers were so extreme that he actually warped and distorted his universe in such a way that it almost spilled over into the multiverse and would have just twisted and screwed up the multiverse. They had to wipe his whole universe out in order to keep him from spreading like a kind of cancer through the whole multiverse. These are your guys like Clyde Wincham, the Marquis of Death, who was able to wipe out whole universes by destabilizing the atomic structure of those universes. The list goes on and on and on. Franklin Richards and so on and so forth. But the biggest problem that you had here when it came to Omega and beyond Omega level is after a while, they just kind of became arbitrary designations. A really good example of this is Gambit. Gambit fans hate it when you say this, but it doesn't change the fact that it's true. When Gambit first developed his powers, he was an Omega level mutant because his powers were extreme. What it is that made him Omega level outside of being a threat to the Earth itself in the same way that Bobby Drake or Storm are, we don't really know. And people just kind of drew that comparison. Well, Iceman could freeze the Earth's core and he's Omega level, and Storm could create storm systems that would make the Earth uninhabitable and she might as well be Omega level. So somebody like Gambit who could blow up the world with his powers, well, he might as well be Omega level too. The thing about Gambit is that he actually ended up trading in some of his power for control over his power, which is why he's not as powerful as he used to be. But the bigger point that I'm making here is this: most characters that you or I or comic book fans would conventionally define as being Omega level were never actually defined as being Omega level in Marvel Comics. We would just kind of indiscriminately give them those titles by comparing them to the powers of characters who were Omega level, right? So we were just kind of cooking the books. So what ends up happening is Jonathan Hickman comes along and he changes all of that. He wipes it all away, starts from scratch. The first thing he says is, we need a definition of what it even means to be Omega level in Marvel Comics. And so getting rid of the beyond Omega level designation, what he says here is that there are powers like shapeshifting that have a defined limit. You can only turn into so many different people or different races because there's only so many people on Earth and there's only so many races that exist across the universe. That's it. But powers like telepathy have no defined limit. If a person or a being is powerful enough, they can use their telepathy to communicate with people across the world or the galaxy or in the universe, or even potentially other universes across the multiverse. No one's done that yet, but potentially they can. And so by establishing this, what he said is reality manipulation is inherently an Omega level power, right? The ability to change and distort reality on varying levels. The ability to manipulate temperature in the case of Iceman, that is Omega level because he's really the only person that can do it. And I'll explain explain why that matters here in a minute. Power manifestation in the case of Legion, the spontaneous development of personalities and powers, that's Omega level. Magnetism is Omega level. Matter manipulation, which is seemingly different than reality manipulation, I never really understood what that difference was. Telekinesis, energy manipulation, power manipulation, right? The ability to like shut off and manipulate powers and so on and so forth. In effect, what Hickman said is that if these powers are powers that have no defined limit, then the question we have to ask is, who's made it the furthest? Right? Who's reached like the highest level so far? And so in essence, when it came to telepathy, that was Jean Grey and Quentin Quire. They are Omega level telepaths. When it came to reality manipulation, the highest person on that list was Franklin Richards, because he had demonstrated the ability to manipulate reality on a universal scale. That was evidence when he was creating universes in the palm of his hand as a little kid. Gabriel Summers with energy manipulation, he can basically control any and all forms of energy. Biokinesis, Joshua Foley, right, also known as Elixir, he can basically manipulate any and all forms of biological life that exists out there. The guy could create worlds if he wanted to. And the list goes on and on and on. So here's what I invite for you guys. If you want to learn more about these varying mutants that are Omega level and beyond Omega level, click this playlist because it runs over all of their powers and their origins and the crazy feats that they've pulled off in their time in Marvel Comics. Keep in mind, it was done before Hickman did this whole thing, and because Marvel's going back to the old classic method, I think it still holds up. But let me know what you guys think down in the comments section, and I will catch you all later. Peace.